Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade. This is the Education Show, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk with James Traub about, among many things, his new book. James, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
For people who may not know you as well as they should or have not yet seen the book, can you introduce yourself in 2 or 3 sentences?
Yes, Alexander, I am a 71-year-old person who has spent 50 years chiefly working as a journalist for every magazine you have ever heard of and many that you have not. I was at one time a contributing writer for the New Yorker, for many years at the New York Times Magazine, etc. I have written a bunch of books in recent years. Most of those are either biographies or intellectual history. I wrote a book called What Was Liberalism? I wrote a biography of John Quincy Adams. And I also, for the last about 15 years, have taught in various capacities at NYU.
And for the purposes of this conversation, which is mostly going to be seen by education journalists, educators, parents, advocates, you've also written and written a book, at least one book, about schools before this one.
I did, and I have to say, somebody told me very kind of famous American historian just said, "Oh, this is the best book about education I've ever read." Which I thought, I wish you had told me that when it came out 30 years ago. I wrote a book about City College called City on a Hill, which is really a book about the clash between some fundamental values. That is the kind of meritocratic value, and then the equal opportunity or affirmative action value. And it was a very painful, ugly fight for a long time there.
And is this what you would call your second education book? I know you've written many education articles, but is this your second book, or are there other books focused on?
No, you're right. You're right. And actually, it's very similar structurally to that book. In both cases, I spent a year or maybe a little more than a year at a school. And so what drives both books forward is the chronology of my own experience, though in both cases, I splice it with a set of broader questions or kind of non-classroom related inquiries that are part of that forward movement, I hope.
City on a Hill was about City College. Let me ask you the impossible question to ask any author. What is The Cradle of Citizenship about?
Well, the easy answer is it's about civic education. The broader answer is it's about what schools do and fail to do in order to shape young people as citizens of a democracy. The premise of the book is that we are a country at whose very founding was the idea that a true democracy in the end depends on the wisdom and therefore the enlightenment and therefore the education of citizens. So this is not a school subject, though it is also that. It is something that is fundamental to a democracy at a moment when our democracy feels more imperiled than it has in any of our lifetimes.
And to boil it down in a way that may make you deeply uncomfortable or prove satisfying, you ended up coming to the belief, if I understand correctly, that classical schools offer an important and little known model for both improving educational outcomes and citizenship. Is that correct, or have I botched it entirely?
What's correct, Alexander, is that you said a model, not the model. You cannot put America into the Procrustean bed of any single form of education. We're just too various. And in any case, local control would make that impossible. There are a lot of kids who would be really unhappy in a classical school. But what I do say is that there are lessons that this kind of education teaches, I think, that apply beyond its borders, because these are schools that believe that kids can and should and must read whole books the time they're very young. These are schools that are quite comfortable with the idea that they are not continuous with the larger culture, but almost countercultural, and therefore don't have a problem saying, we're not going to have phones here. In fact, We're not going to have computers here. In fact, we're not going to have screens of any kind here. You're going to be looking at pages. Well, these turned out to be, I think, powerful lessons.
For people who are not familiar with the classical schools idea, how many of them are there, and where do they fit along with AP or IB or dual enrollment?
Right. So, nobody has an exact count. When I wrote the book, so these numbers may be 12 to 18 months old, people tended to say there are about 275 public schools, almost all charter schools, that call themselves classical. It's a term of art, not a formal definition,
Right.
with maybe 250,000 kids in them. Then you have to add in private schools, which are mostly denominational, both Christian and Catholic. That would be called classical schools. So it's a small fraction of a big country, but it's a very fast growing one. Mostly in red states, it's seen as being traditional, therefore conservative, therefore red, which I think is terribly unfortunate. And I'm all in favor of progressively oriented schools with the kinds of commitments classical schools have, which I don't think is a hopeless contradiction in terms. But just to make it more clear that what the heck these things are, since you've asked me, and I'm sure some people aren't familiar with them, they're schools that self-consciously regard themselves as traditional. Whether or not there really was such a tradition before is almost irrelevant, in the sense that their pedagogy is traditional, their culture is traditional in the sense that you wear a uniform and there's a pretty extensive dress code and generally a behavior code that tends to be pretty firmly enforced. There's a commitment to the classics, which means both in the sense of classical literature and literally in the sense of ancient literature. Kids learn Latin, I think, at all of these schools, and probably a fair number of them you can learn Greek too if you want. So there's a pervasive culture which is pedagogical and personal, but not political. I mean, here is kind of a very important point of friction, which is I spent a fair amount of time in various classical schools. I think with maybe one minor exception, I never heard a teacher say a thing about contemporary politics, and the students would not have known the teacher's politics. I mean, I had some sense from my own conversations with them that the average teacher at these schools is more conservative than the average teacher at a conventional school. But they are very conscious of not making the school political because they see their commitments as pre-political. You always hear at these schools about the importance of enduring verities, above all, truth, beauty, goodness, in the Aristotelian sense. And they see themselves in Aristotelian sense, in an Aristotelian way, or maybe even a less pejorative word might be as liberal education in the small L old-fashioned sense it might have been recognized in a Renaissance court.
The interesting thing about this book is that it comes out at both a time when homeschooling and microschooling, there's a lot of interest in more traditional education, as far as I can tell. And yet we're also in the shadow of the demise of the school reform movement, which included a lot of uniforms and traditional educational approaches. And so I'm curious about where classical schools fit in that sense. And also, I'm very curious about how people have responded to the book so far.
Well, first, is it right that school reform should be thought of in such a monolithic sense? That is, if by school reform you mean things that came out of the George W. Bush moment, which is to say, a focus on basic skills, a skepticism about progressive nostrums in regard to reading and so forth. Yeah, that's right. But you could also say that the recent shift towards what is now referred to as scientific reading pedagogy tells you first that the more progressive notions, whole language, to put it in a teeny tiny overused box, that was very common. That was the norm, and you see a movement away from that as even its advocates like James Traub have now conceded that that's just wrong. So, in that sense, maybe the way I would put it is my impression is that the world is full of people who kind of describe themselves like me as being politically liberal, pedagogically sort of traditional, and don't see those two things as being in any way in contradiction to each other. Only in the United States, I know, is pedagogy so seen in ideological terms that if you're a person who's left of center, you have to believe that children learn in this particular way. And if you're a person right of center, you think this other way. Well, why should that be true? I mean, we're talking about cognitive science and cognitive psychology, not polemics. And so part of the reaction to the book so far, and of course it's very early days, is people saying, well, wow, that sounds really good. How come they only have this kind of schooling in, Texas and Florida and Arkansas? Is there some reason it couldn't be elsewhere? And I say, no, I think there is no reason.
But to what extent would Catholic schools, or what used to be called no excuses charter schools, fit into the classical schools model as you see it? Do they connect at all or not at all?
No excuses charter schools, as I understand, wouldn't fit in at all.
Okay.
So the premise of these schools, all the ones I've been to, is that student and teacher together are embarked in some kind of very important journey of understanding and of seeking things which one cannot ultimately find. It may be that many of these schools actually do tell you this is truth, this is goodness, this is beauty. The ones I went to didn't. They would say these are the things which an educated person pursues because that's what it means to be educated. I think of no excuse schools as being kind of the emergency medical service of the school world, which is to say, you have these kids who you fear are going to fail in life because they haven't mastered basic skills. And we are not going to let them out of here until they've mastered basic skills. Well, I don't think that's a trivial thing at all. I think it's a very serious profession. But that's only the beginning. And if you make the mastery of these basic skills feel like a form of punishment, how is a child ever going to feel that learning is a beautiful thing? So no, I would actually really eschew that comparison. The Catholic school comparison, I would say, well, it kind of depends on the Catholic school. A right. Jesuit school, yes, I would say it's like a Jesuit school.
Got it. One of the fascinations of the grade, which is this project that I've been involved with for the past 10 years, has to do with understanding the relationship between schools and journalism. And this both encompasses the education reporters and editors who work solely on the beat, and then also includes journalists and others who come in and out of the of writing about or thinking about or covering schools. You're a fascinating character from this perspective because you have written about an enormous number of topics, but you have written about schools a number of times along the way. I had the pleasure of going back and looking at the Times Magazine articles you wrote about Ocean Hill-Brownsville or about the beginnings of what would end up being No Child Left Behind. I'm curious, and you've also had this perspective as both a journalist writing a story that you wanted people to read and an author writing books that you hope people would think about.
If I can add, I'm also someone who for many years was on the board of a charter school, and I started a volunteer program through Penn about 15 years ago that brings writers into the schools as tutors, which I continue to run and feel very proud of and love very much. So I have those connections too.
This is excellent. So I have always wanted journalists to reflect a little bit about how schools are depicted in journalism. And I'm curious about whether you have, as a journalist or as an author or as a organization head, in the ways that you've described, have you had thoughts or changes of thought about how schools are depicted and whether the depictions of schools in journalism are accurate, helpful, etc.?
Huh. Well, the first thing I should say is no, I haven't thought about that very much. It's a very important question, but I wouldn't want to hold myself out as being someone who's given deep thought to the question. So here's the answer that comes to my mind, which is it's very hard to really describe well the central transaction of a school, which is to say, this transaction between a teacher and a student, this act of learning, because it's something in a way impalpable because it happens inside a kid's head. It's so much easier to describe things like the atmosphere in the hall. Is it crazy or not? Or all of the political questions or demographic questions or racial questions that surround the classroom. I mean, our classrooms are such intensely they're not politicized in fact, they're politicized in the public imagination. I would say, actually, in fact, one thing that struck me is how rare it was to hear overt politicization. But to go back to my thought, I think that the hard thing for an education journalist, and I may be an example of this because I wrote so much about many of these larger political questions. The hard thing is to really try to understand and show, what is happening or isn't happening between a teacher and a student, because all the other stuff is surround, and that's the central thing.
Have you, in this book or at other times, felt like you have had moments of success in capturing this invisible transaction, as you describe it?
In this book, yes. I have to go back and think. In years past, yeah, I mean, it's funny, because now I'm thinking about painful stuff where you feel like a classroom is just, dead. Or, I mean, God knows when I wrote about City College, I had a whole chapter about a person named Leonard Jeffries, who was this famous kind of racial arsonist. And I think I really captured that classroom in a way that I actually thought was, terrible. But in this book, I really tried to do that. And I hope that people who care about this stuff, i.e. your audience, will recognize both the good and the bad. And so there are, half a dozen descriptions of wonderful classrooms where I felt almost euphoric. Some of them are in classical schools, but some are not. I'm actually in the middle right now of seeing how I go about nominating one of the teachers I saw for the Gilbert Lehrman Institute's American History Teacher of the Year. And then there are classrooms that they were so painful because they were silent or because nobody had anything like the answer the teacher wanted. And you have to talk about that stuff too. And I think that, anyone in your world, any of these education writers will recognize those classrooms from their own experience.
Are there other people, other journalists or writers that you've come across who come to mind? And I'm asking you this out of the blue, so feel free to decline. But are there other people who come to mind who've been able to capture the important qualities of schools as you've come to understand them? Either
when I was going back, first of all, I'm just not a good enough student of current education journalism, so just please excuse me in that regard. But I was going back to read Jonathan Kozol. Is this book called Darkness at Noon, the book about schools in Boston?
I don't remember.
Anyway, I thought, what a beautiful book. And I think of him as being a real ideologue,
Right.
and someone whose views probably don't align to my own. But reading it, he was a very young man when he wrote this book in, I don't know, 1966 or something. It's so beautifully written.
Mm.
Of a similar generation, John Silberman, uh, again, someone I wouldn't totally agree with, wrote beautifully about schools. But I'm afraid if you ask me today, I'm just not a good enough judge because, I live in a bunch of different worlds and this is just one, so I just don't know it well enough.
Back in the day, I came to journalism from working in policy and politics. And back in the day, I remember a journalist named Sarah Mosley who wrote about.
Sarah.
She,
You
I
give me an
thought,
example of someone who writes wonderfully about the schools. Thank you for mentioning her name. I knew
and
her
then
when she was a young pup.
and then in the current day, there are some journalists, and I'm not thinking that you'll know them, but some of the best journalists are almost not education journalists. They are amazing in their ability to describe the ecosystem of schools, where schools live in the lives of parents and families and students societally. There's a great reporter at the Associated Press named Bianca Vasquez Tones, but their strength is almost in situating schools in a larger social fabric rather than capturing the moment of learning in the classroom. A different skill, an important one, very compelling, but not so central to learning as you or I
Right.
might understand it.
Schools as an institution, and then there's this cognitive at its core. As I say, because that thing is kind of impalpable or not fully visible to us, it's harder to capture.
You've identified the struggles that journalists have capturing classroom learning, for lack of a doesn't have to happen in a classroom, but learning. One of the other issues that I've encountered, and I'm curious about your experience, is the overemphasis on anomalous conflicts or tragedies. One that you came close to mentioning has to do with this issue of the politicized classroom. I had a chance to interview a UPenn academic named Jonathan Zimmerman, who basically wrote that he had thought that classrooms were highly politicized, and that culture wars were being enacted in classrooms every day, but that when he surveyed or digested research about what was going on in schools and went and visited them, he found that that was actually not what was happening so much. But if you read education journalism today, you'd think that people were fighting about these things all the time. Does that match up with your understanding?
Yes, so I've had this fight with some of the right wing polemicists on this subject because
Okay.
they tell you that there are these things like action civics, which, despite its innocent name, is a cover for overt left wing political activity, this whole line. And so I say, I actually spend a lot of time in classrooms where they're doing that kind of thing or some other thing that, they assure their reader is just a stalking horse for the left wing domination of the public schools. And I say, I've been to a lot of classrooms uh, where this subject is there, and I've never seen this form of indoctrination. And one person with whom I had this exchange said, well, clearly they know you're coming. And so they suppress the polemics. And I said, it doesn't really feel like that. So there is this a priori insistence, and this is especially a disease of the right. There's this a priori insistence that the kinds of polemics that are real, that you hear from education scholars and activists and so on, that those must be getting reproduced in the classroom. Well, it's so much easier to read a tract than it is to actually spend time in a school. And so they just reason from the tract up here to the classroom down here. Well, it's not so. It's really the idea that you as a teacher have a responsibility to allow the student to come to his or her own conclusions about the world is a near universal conviction among teachers, whatever their personal politics. So I found that to be a hugely hyperbolized claim.
And then what does the journalist do with this situation? Someone says classroom is being radicalized. Uh, they produce a document or a snippet of video or a line in a curriculum. There's a debate that begins about whether this is happening or not. A few years ago, the debate was about CRT in the classroom, for example. And then journalists are drawn in covering the conflict between the adults about the thing that, according to you and Jonathan Zimmerman, if I understand you and correctly, isn't actually happening. What's the reporter to do?
Well, first of all, the reporter is to be honest about this thing. And so it's not that it's never happening. I have a chapter in my book about Minneapolis, a city that now, of course, is famous for being, besieged by Trump's jackbooted thugs. Well, at least since the George Floyd moment, but really before then, Minneapolis has been a deeply progressive state with a deep streak of a kind of identitarian ethos. And you see this in the schools. And culturally relevant teaching. I saw very few examples of that. The one example that I saw, I found hair raising, and I describe it in vivid and I hope hair raising detail. So it is important to say, not you guys on the right are wrong, that doesn't exist, but rather to say it's a problem of a very different nature and of smaller scope than you say it is. And so you can't do that until you've spent a lot of time sitting in classrooms, which I did.
And that's the solution, not to deny CRT ever happens, just to use an example, but to point out that the examples may not be, to give context to the claim.
And to recognize that, once they close the door of their classroom, you may think this is a good thing or a bad thing. I would say probably it's both. Once they close the door of their classroom, teachers can do what they want. And so whatever the formal commitments of the school system, the state, teachers in their classroom will do what they're inclined to do. And so that's why it's not a good guide to, let's say, read state standards, which could be really ideologically skewed, and
Right.
assume that that's what's being propagated in the classroom. There should not be such ideologically skewed state standards. They matter, but you shouldn't assume that therefore everybody is singing from that hymnal.
One last question, and thank you again for sharing your thoughts about the book and about journalism, about schools. The constant concern and complaint I hear from people who want to write about schools is about the challenges of getting access to schools and classrooms in order to be able to depict them accurately. What have you learned? What have you done that allows you to get access?
Well, don't assume I'll say something historical first, since I've been doing this for close to 40 years. But I kind of did it for many years and then went away. I was shocked when I came back at the level of suspicion. So in the 1990s, I picked up the phone and called the principal and said, I'm writing for the New York Times Magazine. Can I come to your school? Yes. That era is long gone. So there were cases with schools where I had been recommended by someone very important to them. I had volunteers from my little tutoring program working there. I had given them every reason to know that I was eager and sympathetic, and yet nevertheless, there was every attempt to keep me out of the school, which I had to counteract by calling the head of public affairs for the New York City Department of Education, and even then it was sharply circumscribed. So, I get the sense of being besieged, But I can't help thinking that if you're a school that's confident about what you're doing, unless you have a reason to distrust the specific reporter in question, you would say, come see what we're doing. And I do want to say that in the case of the classical schools, I received only encouragement. Come see what you want to see, talk who you want to talk to. And that experience was very different from what I received elsewhere. And in red states, it was like Florida, I could not visit a school.
Oh, interesting. So this wasn't just a New York City, big city school system thing.
No. In Florida, where there's a chapter in my book about a social studies conference that I attended in Florida, because I wanted to hear teachers talk about all the bizarro state laws they have there. And then I thought, well, now I need to go to schools. And I had met teachers, and I said, could you help me, get access to someone in your school system? They either wouldn't because they were afraid to, or they couldn't. So I think I tried 3 or 4 different school districts, and I struck out in each case.
And in the cases you were successful, it involved multiple calls or multiple avenues of approach. Is that?
Well, so Minneapolis, here's another weird one. Minneapolis. So I get the names of a number of teachers who won State Teacher of the Year awards, and I get their emails because those are the kind of people who'd be sympathetic. Never heard that. Finally, I got the name of a woman who runs a wonderful after-school program, which works with a number of schools. And I called her and I said, here I am. I'd love to see your after-school program, but I also, want suggestions for school. She said, oh, okay, here's a middle school and here's a high school, and I bet they're welcome. And they did. But it took a lot of work on my part.
Thank you again for talking. Before we wrap up, what are you up to next? Are you doing a tour? Are you speaking? Where can we track your conversation? Or
Alexander, I wish I could say I were doing a tour, but I'm not. I'm doing a lot of podcasts like yours. So I've done some talks. I talked at I had a wonderful conversation at the New York Historical Society last week. And I talked to the fellows of the New York Institute for the Humanities. That, of course, is all quite local. No, mostly I've been on podcasts, and now I'm thinking about my next book.
And where, if folks want to find you on your next podcast, is there a central place to go, or should they just hope to come across your name?
So you have now revealed something important to me, which is I hadn't even thought that there was such a category of person. But in case there is such a category of person, I guess I better begin posting that. I have a Squarespace, my own personal website, Traub James. And, I guess I better write down my future podcast appearances. So, Alexander, thanks for that suggestion.
I'm not sure it's worth it to do, but I know that authors commonly list where they're appearing or what events they're at. And I'm sure there's some people who would want to find it. So Traub James is the place to go?
Yeah, right.
Excellent. James Traub, thank you so much for talking about your book and about education journalism. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.